Hello, my name is Lindsay. I'm 63 years old, and I want to share a story that changed my life forever. It all began when I caught my husband cheating. My heart shattered, and I packed my bags, convinced I had to leave our home and my life behind for good. Every tear felt like it was marking the end of 40 years of marriage, and I was ready to walk away from everything I thought I knew. But at 6 a.m., just as I was about to leave, there was a knock on my door. It was my neighbor, Margaret, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She grabbed my arm and begged, "Don't go. Trust me." Confused and shaken, I asked her why, and she whispered, "You'll soon understand." Her fear unsettled me, but I couldn't imagine what she meant. The hours passed, and I tried to process her words while my mind raced with betrayal and hurt. Nothing, however, could have prepared me for what came next. At 11 a.m., there was a sharp, insistent knock at my door. Two police officers were standing there, their expressions grave. My stomach dropped, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hardly breathe as they told me that something had happened to Richard, something I could never have predicted. In that moment, every worry I had about leaving seemed to vanish, replaced by a chilling realization that the world I thought I knew had shifted entirely in the span of a few hours. I don't want to give it all away just yet, because the truth is even more shocking than I could have imagined. Secrets, lies, and betrayals unfolded in ways that made me question everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and even myself. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and discovering all the different places people are tuning in from. Now let's uncover how this story really began. When I caught Richard cheating, it wasn't a scene from a movie. There was no dramatic music, no shouting. Just silence, a suffocating, airless silence that filled the bedroom where I'd spent 40 years of my life loving a man I thought I knew. His laughter with her, that soft, rehearsed chuckle, was what broke me, not the act itself. I stood in the doorway, the morning light falling through the curtains like broken glass, and I realized I had become invisible to him long before that moment. I remember the way my hands trembled as I zipped the suitcase. The sound of the zipper was deafening, a metallic scream against the stillness of the house. I was 63 years old, and everything that had once been solid, our home, our marriage, my identity, felt like it was dissolving. The walls seemed to breathe with memories, the laughter of our children, the smell of Sunday pancakes, the way Richard used to hum when fixing the sink. Every detail mocked me. At 6 a.m., I carried my suitcase to the front door. The sky outside was a washed-out gray, the kind of color that sits between night and day, between hope and resignation. I had made peace with leaving, or at least I thought I had, when a frantic knock jolted me back into the present. When I opened the door, Margaret stood there, her robe wrapped tightly around her, her face pale as parchment. She was usually the picture of composure, calm, cheerful, always ready with a plate of cookies and the latest neighborhood gossip. But that morning, she looked like someone who had seen a ghost. "Lindsay," she whispered, clutching my arm with surprising strength. "Please don't go. Not yet. Trust me." Her eyes were wide, shimmering with something between fear and sorrow. "Margaret, I can't stay another minute in this house," I said, my voice cracking. "Richard destroyed everything we built together." She glanced nervously toward my house, as if the walls could hear her. Then she leaned closer, her breath trembling. "You'll understand tonight. Please, just wait until tonight. I'm begging you." Her words landed like stones in my chest. I searched her face for an explanation, but she just stood there, shaking, her lips pressed tight as if she were holding back a secret too heavy to speak aloud. The rational part of me wanted to ignore her, to get into the car, drive away, and never look back. But something in her eyes, that raw, genuine terror, rooted me to the doorstep. Against every instinct, I nodded and slowly wheeled my suitcase back inside. When the door closed behind me, I leaned against it, tears blurring my vision. The house felt colder, emptier. I walked into the living room and sat on the couch, staring at the framed photos of our life together. There we were on our wedding day, young and full of foolish hope. There we were with our children, Emma and David, laughing in the backyard. And there, the last photo, our 40th anniversary party, smiles polished for the camera, hiding a truth I hadn't yet dared to see. The hours crawled by in silence. The ticking clock in the kitchen was the only sound, marking each second of a life that no longer felt like mine. I made tea, but the cup went cold untouched. My thoughts drifted between anger and disbelief, replaying Margaret's desperate expression over and over. What could she possibly mean? You'll understand tonight. At 11 o'clock a.m., sharp knocks shattered the stillness again. This time, they weren't frantic, they were heavy, deliberate. I froze. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes, uniformed, tall official. When I opened the door, two police officers stood on the porch. The older one, Detective Morrison, had eyes that seemed to have seen too much. The younger officer beside her looked uneasy, avoiding my gaze. Mrs. Lindsay Hartwell? Morrison asked, her tone careful, professional. Yes. We need to ask you a few questions about your husband, Richard Hartwell. My heart lurched. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. What happened? Is Richard okay? Morrison exchanged a look with her partner before answering. Ma'am, your husband was found dead this morning at the Riverside Motel. We have reason to believe it wasn't natural causes. The words didn't make sense at first. They floated in the air, disconnected, unreal. I remember gripping the doorframe to steady myself. Dead, Richard? The man who had betrayed me less than 24 hours ago. I don't understand, I managed to whisper. There must be a mistake. I'm sorry, ma'am, Morrison said gently. We'll need you to come down to the station later to answer some questions. But for now, please stay home. They left me standing in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter. I closed the door slowly, my mind reeling. Richard was dead. The man who had shared my bed, my dreams, my disappointments, gone. Just like that. I sank to the floor, pressing my palms to my temples. My tears came not from love or loss, but from confusion, from the unbearable mix of relief and grief twisting inside me. How could I mourn someone who had betrayed me so deeply? Yet how could I not? When I finally managed to stand, I went to the window and looked toward Margaret's house. The curtains were drawn, but I could see her silhouette pacing back and forth. She knew. Somehow, she had known something would happen. As the day dimmed into evening, I sat in the darkened living room waiting for what? I didn't know. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, felt charged with meaning. My suitcase still sat by the door, half unpacked, like a question I couldn't yet answer. When the phone finally rang, I jumped. It was Emma, my daughter, her voice sharp with worry. Mom, I just heard from the police. What's going on? They said Dad's dead. Are you okay? I wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck. I'm trying to be. After she hung up, I walked to the kitchen window. The street was quiet, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. Across the way, Margaret's light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw her watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. My mind kept replaying the morning, Margaret's pale face, her trembling voice. You'll understand tonight. And now I did. Or at least I thought I did. The man who had betrayed me was dead, and somehow, my neighbor had known it would happen. When the clock struck midnight, I sat by the window, staring at the police tape that now fluttered faintly across the street, and felt a cold realization seep into my bones. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. I sat on the edge of my living room sofa, the cushions pressing against my legs but offering no comfort. My hands shook uncontrollably, fingers curling and uncurling, like they were trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. Across from me, Detective Morrison's face was unreadable, professional, yet somehow heavy with the weight of what she had to say. I had never felt so small, so exposed, so fragile. Mrs. Hartwell, she began gently, yet with a firmness that made my stomach drop. We've run the tests. Your husband, he was poisoned. A slow-acting toxin was found in his system. We believe he ingested it over several hours. The words hit me like a physical blow. My vision blurred, and I clutched my knees, trying to steady myself. Poison. Richard. Dead. The simple clarity of it was terrifying. My mind spiraled, trying to reconcile the image of my husband lying in that cheap motel room with the man I had shared decades of my life with. The man who had betrayed me, yet who had also once been my anchor. Detective Morrison leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and searching. Mrs. Hartwell, where were you between midnight and 6 a.m.? I wanted to scream, to tell her they didn't understand, that the hours had been spent in grief, packing up a life that no longer felt like mine. But instead, my voice came out as a fragile whisper. I was here. I was packing. I discovered my husband's affair yesterday, and I was planning to leave this morning. The air in the room seemed to thicken. I felt their gaze like a vice tightening around my heart. The detectives exchanged a glance that made my blood run cold, like a silent accusation hanging in the space between us. My mind raced. Could they really think I had? Could they suspect I had done it? So Morrison said, her tone flat, almost clinical, you had motive. A cheating husband, a 40-year marriage about to end. That's a powerful reason for anger. I could feel the pulse in my temples, the hot rush of panic mixed with indignation. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass of water across the room, to shake them until they saw the truth in my eyes. I would never. I'm not capable of murder. Yes, I was furious, devastated, broken beyond words, but kill him, no, never. Her expression didn't soften. She simply nodded, as though my protests were expected, as though she had heard them 1,000 times before from women and men with broken hearts and guilty suspicions. The hour passed in a haze of questions, my throat raw from speaking, my mind spinning. Every detail they asked for, every "what were you doing?" felt like a subtle accusation, a shadow of doubt creeping into my very soul. Finally, they left. Detective Morrison's parting words chilled me more than any accusation could. Don't leave town, Mrs. Hartwell. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the house seemed colder, the walls pressing in, the shadows sharper, more threatening. I couldn't sit still. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed my coat and rushed to Margaret's house. The heels of my slippers thudding against the hardwood floors. Every step felt urgent, necessary, like running towards salvation or disaster. I couldn't tell which. My hand knocked on her door with a violence that startled even me. She opened it slowly, her face pale, guilt written into every line of her expression. Her eyes met mine, shimmering with something between sorrow and fear. Lindsay, I'm so sorry. I wanted to warn you, but I didn't know how, she whispered, her voice trembling. You knew Richard was going to die, I asked, my own voice tight with disbelief. How could you possibly know that? Margaret's hands shook as she pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. The faint click of the lock echoed in the quiet house, sealing us into a bubble of urgency and truth. She turned to face me, her eyes wide, a shadow of terror lingering in their depths. Because, she said, her voice barely audible, I saw someone tampering with his coffee thermos last night at the motel parking lot. Someone wearing a red coat. I froze. My breath caught, my chest tightening as if the air itself had turned to stone. Who was it? I asked, my voice a fragile thread of sound, trembling between hope and dread. Margaret shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. I couldn't see their face, she admitted, but Lindsay, you own a red coat. And I'm terrified the police will find out I saw someone. They'll think it was you. The room seemed to tilt. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. I felt a cold wave of fear and disbelief sweep over me, but beneath it, something else stirred, a spark of clarity. Someone had used my presence, my identity as a weapon. Someone had planned this. I sank into the nearest chair, my hands covering my face, trembling uncontrollably. Margaret, someone used me, I whispered, more to myself than to her. My voice caught in my throat, a sob buried deep in the wreckage of my soul. Margaret knelt beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, grounding me in a way that surprised us both. I know, Lindsay. I know. That's why I couldn't tell anyone before. I was afraid for you, for what they might do. I leaned into her touch, the warmth of her presence a fragile lifeline amid the storm raging inside me. I thought of Richard, his betrayal, his death, the poisoning that had stolen him away, and a strange mixture of grief and determination began to settle over me. I realized then that the only way through this darkness was not to run, but to face it. To untangle the lies, to uncover the truth, and to reclaim my life from the shadows that had sought to trap it. Margaret's voice brought me back from the edge. We'll figure it out together, she said softly. You're not alone in this. Not anymore. Her words, simple as they were, carried a weight that I clung to. For the first time that day, amidst the fear and confusion, I felt the faintest stirrings of hope. My life had been shattered, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be rebuilt. Not the same life as before, stronger, wiser, more vigilant. And maybe, in that reconstruction, I could find something I had long forgotten, courage. We sat together in the quiet of her living room, the night pressing against the windows, And for the first time since Richard's death, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I could stand again, whole and unafraid. The air inside St. Mary's Church was heavy with the scent of lilies and wax, the faint aroma of incense mixing with the cold, damp November morning. I walked slowly down the aisle, my hands gripping the edges of my coat, as if it were a lifeline, as if holding on could somehow keep me from collapsing into the grief that had been building like a storm for 3 days. Every step echoed against the stone floors, a solemn drum marking the passage of someone I had loved, betrayed, and yet still mourned. My daughter, Emma, arrived just moments before the service began, slipping into a pew with the kind of sharp efficiency only she could manage. Her eyes met mine, and I saw it instantly, barely concealed hostility, suspicion woven into every glance. The guilt I had carried since the morning Richard died now had a new weight, pressed down by the piercing gaze of my own child. "Mother," she said quietly at first, but her tone carried an edge that made my stomach twist. "The police called me. They think you killed Dad." I froze. My heart thumped like a trapped bird. "Emma," I whispered, forcing my voice steady, "you know me. I've spent my life helping others, volunteering at the shelter, being there for this family. How could you believe I'd do this?" Her eyes didn't soften. "You had every reason to hate him," she said coldly. "He humiliated you." The words were simple, cruel, and painfully true. I had hated him, yes. I had felt the sting of betrayal, the collapse of a 40-year marriage in a single moment. But hate, no matter how deep, had never made me capable of murder. Beside her, David stood silently, the weight of his presence more cutting than any accusation could be. His lips pressed into a thin line, hands clenched, eyes downcast. I could feel the unspoken judgment radiating from him, and it twisted inside me. It hurt more because I knew it came from love, a child's love distorted by grief, by confusion, by the need to understand a man they had once adored, now gone and irretrievably tangled in deceit. The service passed in a blur of ritual and tears. The words of the priest, intended to comfort, fell on ears too raw to hear, a litany that felt distant and hollow. I felt like a ghost in my own life, walking among people who remembered only the Richard I had known and mourned, unaware of the darkness that had haunted the final months of his life. At the reception, the soft murmur of polite condolences and the clink of silverware on plates formed a backdrop to the tension that had begun to coil in my chest. I had barely taken a sip of lukewarm coffee when Thomas approached. His smile was smooth, calculated, a snake smile that made my skin crawl despite the warmth of the room. "Lindsay," he said, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder, "I'm sure this is difficult, but we need to discuss Richard's will. As executor, I should inform you that there are complications." My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the table, the porcelain coffee cup rattling faintly against the saucer. "What kind of complications, Thomas?" My voice, though quiet, carried the tremor of fear and disbelief. His smile widened. "Richard changed his will 2 weeks ago," he said smoothly. "The house, the savings, the investment accounts, they're not yours anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back slightly, as if the air itself had been stolen from my lungs. "That's impossible," I whispered. "We owned everything jointly. We built this life together." "Not anymore," Thomas said, tilting his head, the image of calm calculation etched into his expression. "He left everything to someone else. Someone he truly loved." I opened my mouth, but the word stuck. My throat was raw, my mind blank, a storm of disbelief and betrayal swirling in my chest. I felt faint, as if the room had become an echo chamber, every whisper bouncing back at me, accusing, mocking the life I thought I had. Then, the church doors burst open with a sudden force that made the chatter around us hush. A young woman in her 20s stumbled in, tears streaking her face, clutching the small hand of a child who looked up at the crowd with wide, innocent eyes. The child's blue gaze, so unmistakably Richard's, pierced me through and through. And my heart contracted painfully. "That's Richard's real family," Thomas announced loudly, his voice triumphant, making sure every head turned to witness the spectacle. I felt the room spin around me. My knees threatened to buckle, but I held onto the edge of the pew, the wood biting into my palms as if to remind me that I still existed, that I still had to breathe, had to see, had to act. The young woman's sobs were quiet, almost apologetic, yet they reverberated in my chest. The child clung to her, small fingers entwined in hers, unaware of the whirlwind of betrayal and secrets swirling around him. Emma's gasp cut through the silence. Dad had another child? All this time. The incredulity in her voice mirrored my own inner turmoil. The disbelief, the hurt, the sense that everything we had known about our family had been a lie. The young woman, her voice trembling but determined, spoke softly. I'm Jessica. I loved him, and this is Noah, his son. I'm so sorry for your loss, but you deserve to know the truth. I wanted to shrink into myself, to melt into the shadows, to escape the reality that confronted me so brutally. My fingers dug into the edge of the pew, nails biting into my skin, grounding me against the whirl of emotions, grief, rage, despair, confusion, and the faint, fragile pulse of clarity beginning to stir. In that moment, I realized that the life I had known, the orderly, comfortable life of 40 years, the predictable patterns of love and betrayal, had fractured irreparably. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a glimmer of something else, the chance to see truth clearly, to rise from the debris of Richard's deceit, and to forge a new path for myself and my children. I met Emma's eyes, and for the first time in hours, I let myself feel the depth of her pain, her fear, her love twisted by confusion. David stood silently beside her, his presence both accusing and protective. I knew I had to carry all this, to hold it with compassion, even while the anger and heartbreak burned inside me like fire. And as I watched the young mother cradle the boy who was both my husband's son and a symbol of the life that had been hidden from me, I felt something shift inside. A resolve, quiet but fierce, that I would uncover the truth, protect the innocent, and find justice, not just for Richard, flawed as he had been, but for myself, my children, and this child. This unexpected life intertwined with mine. The world had changed in a matter of minutes, but I realized that grief, betrayal, and heartbreak could also become a catalyst, a push toward clarity, strength, and the first tentative steps toward healing. I would not allow this darkness to define me. I would rise, with trembling hands and a determined heart, and reclaim the life that had been stolen from me in ways I could only begin to understand. Jessica stood at the edge of the room, small and trembling, her hand gripping Noah's tightly as if the boy's presence was both her shield and her anchor. She was 28, younger than I had expected, and yet there was a maturity in the lines around her eyes, a depth born from years of living in the shadow of someone else's life. For a long moment, she said nothing, just let the weight of the room press against her shoulders. I watched her, my own grief mingling with a strange, cautious curiosity. Finally, she spoke, her voice a fragile tremor that carried across the hushed crowd. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this must be shocking, but I loved Richard too. Her hand tightened around Noah's, and I caught sight of the little boy's face, round cheeks, a delicate nose, and eyes. Oh God, the eyes. Richard's unmistakable, piercing blue eyes stared back at me with an innocence that made my heart constrict painfully. And this is Noah, she continued, swallowing hard. He's 4 years old. The room seemed to erupt around us. Whispers ricocheted off the high ceilings, people craning their necks to get a glimpse of the child who carried the features of a man they had only just mourned. I could feel the weight of every gaze, every speculative thought, pressing against me like the walls themselves were closing in. Emma gasped, her voice sharp and disbelieving. Dad had another child? All this time. I felt my stomach twist, a strange mix of sorrow, disbelief, and something that hovered close to betrayal. And yet, as I looked at Noah, I realized he was blameless in all of this. The child had done nothing but exist, and he deserved to be seen, to be loved, to have a place in a family that could only now begin to understand him. Jessica's tears were flowing freely now, streaking her cheeks as she struggled to maintain her composure. Richard promised me he would leave you and marry me, she said, her voice breaking. He told me that you were cold, that your marriage had been dead for years. Something inside me snapped, not with the fire of anger, but with a crystalline clarity that cut through the fog of grief and confusion. I could feel my spine straighten, my breath sharpen, a cold light of understanding illuminating the shadows around me. That's a lie, Jessica, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. Richard and I were planning our 40th anniversary trip to Italy just last month. We were still us, Even if flawed, even if imperfect, Thomas, ever the opportunist, raised a hand and waved papers in the air like a prize. Then why did he leave you everything? He demanded, his voice sharp, greedy. Why did he name Jessica as the sole beneficiary of his estate? I looked at the document he held. The ink was fresh enough to make my heart race. The words a brutal accusation against the memory of the man I had loved. But I refused to let fear or rage cloud the clarity I now held. My hands, steady despite the rapid hammering of my heart, rested on the papers. Because someone manipulated him, I said evenly, my eyes locking onto Thomas's with a quiet fury that needed no words. Richard had been acting strange these past few months, forgetful, paranoid, unlike himself. He was not fully in control. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally stood, her posture hesitant but determined. Lindsay, she said softly, her voice carrying across the room, I need to tell you something. I saw Richard at Dr. Patterson's office repeatedly. He looked confused. Lindsay. He didn't seem himself. Jessica's face went pale, the color draining away as if the very air in the room had conspired against her. He was seeing a doctor, she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible. Not just any doctor, Margaret continued, her words deliberate, cautious. A neurologist. I overheard the receptionist mention early onset dementia. The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence, the weight of Margaret's words pressing down on everyone present. I could feel the implications settling into my chest like stones. If Richard had dementia, the will could be contested, and someone might have taken advantage of his deteriorating mental state. The threads of deceit, manipulation, and greed began to unravel in my mind, forming a pattern I could almost grasp, though the pain of betrayal still cut like knives. Noah shifted slightly in Jessica's arms and my heart ached with a new kind of sorrow. For the child, for the woman, and for the man we had all loved in different ways. They had all been caught in a storm they could not control, manipulated by forces stronger and crueler than any of us had imagined. I reached out a hand, almost instinctively, and placed it gently on Jessica's arm. Her eyes met mine, wide and searching, and for a brief moment, there was understanding, a fragile bridge forming between two women who had both loved the same man, yet in completely different ways. You didn't know, I whispered, and she nodded, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. No one could have known, I added softly. Emma's eyes, still wide with shock, softened slightly as she stepped closer. She reached for Noah's tiny hand, hesitating before her fingers brushed against his palm. He's our family too, she said quietly, as if speaking the truth out loud made it real. I nodded, feeling a strange swell of hope amidst the chaos. Perhaps this revelation, devastating as it was, could be the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild trust, to nurture love where it had been absent, and to protect the innocence that remained untainted by deceit. Margaret's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, her presence a steady reassurance in the storm. We'll figure this out, Lindsay, she said gently. We'll make it right for all of us. And for the first time since Richard's death, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to imagine a path forward where grief and betrayal did not define us, but rather became the soil from which courage, compassion, and clarity could grow. I looked at Noah, at Jessica, at my children, and I understood that this tangled, painful web of secrets could also be a bridge to understanding, to healing, and perhaps to redemption. Even amid the shadows of betrayal, I realized that love could endure. It could survive deceit. It could be reshaped, reborn, and strengthened. And in that realization, I felt the faintest pulse of hope, a quiet promise that we could all, somehow, find a way to be whole again. The following morning, I walked into Eleanor Martinez's downtown office feeling as though I were stepping into a battlefield I had never trained for. Eleanor, sharp-eyed and composed, rose to greet me with a firmness that both intimidated and comforted. She was in her 50s, with streaks of silver in her hair that spoke of years navigating the murky waters of legal battles and human frailty. There was a weight to her presence, a quiet assurance that even in the face of corruption and manipulation, she knew how to fight. Lindsay, she began, motioning for me to sit. If we can prove Richard wasn't of sound mind when he changed the will, we can fight this. It's not easy and it won't be quick, but there's a path forward. Her voice carried determination, but also empathy. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps justice could still be claimed. We spent hours that morning poring over the documents I had managed to collect, the official will, financial statements, and phone logs that now seemed like pieces of a cruel puzzle. Eleanor's sharp eyes scanned each page, nodding in acknowledgement, occasionally muttering under her breath, "Interesting, very interesting." I spent the next 2 weeks in a relentless blur of discovery, piecing together Richard's life in a way I had never dared to imagine. I scoured medical records, tracking appointments and diagnoses. I traced every transaction in our accounts, discovering withdrawals that made my blood boil, $200,000 siphoned from our retirement fund over 6 months into an offshore account I had never heard of. Each number, each entry felt like a betrayal etched into ink and paper. And then there were the phone logs. Night after night, I saw the same pattern, late calls, always when I was asleep, always to Thomas, the voice of my husband's own brother. The man I had once welcomed into our home as family, now became a sinister presence threading through the evidence. A cold, calculated manipulation was starting to take shape before my eyes. I met with Dr. Patterson again, the neurologist who had treated Richard, my heart pounding as I awaited confirmation of my worst fears. "Doctor," I asked, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk, "did he have dementia? Was he aware of what he was signing?" The doctor's eyes were solemn, and he nodded slowly. Richard was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 8 months ago. He was aware at times, but his cognitive abilities were deteriorating faster than most would expect. And someone accompanied him to every appointment. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Do you remember who?" "His brother, Dr. Patterson said, his voice steady but grave. "Thomas Hartwell. He told me he was helping Richard manage his affairs." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Thomas. My own brother-in-law. All those late-night calls, all those withdrawals, all the changes to the will, they were not mistakes, not coincidences. They were pieces of a conspiracy that I had been blind to. I had lived 43 years in what I thought was an honest life, a life of care and responsibility. And yet, the truth had been hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the guise of family trust and concern. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had baked cookies for neighbors, prepared countless family dinners, celebrated holidays and birthdays, and shared ordinary moments I now realized had been cloaked in deceit. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint drip of the sink seemed louder than ever, echoing in a space suddenly hollow with betrayal. I stared at the dark wood of the table, at the crumbs of a life that had been quietly dismantled. It was then that my phone rang. Seeing David's name made my chest tighten, a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Mom," he said, voice heavy with guilt, "I'm sorry I doubted you. Emma and we've been talking. Something doesn't add up about Uncle Thomas." I felt a surge of determination, a spark of clarity cutting through the fog. "I know, sweetheart. And I'm going to prove it." After we hung up, I checked my email, my hands still trembling. Among the usual clutter, a single message stood out: "Check Richard's office safe. The combination is your wedding anniversary. Someone wanted you to find this." I stared at the screen, disbelief and cautious hope warring inside me. The old office had been a place of memories, triumphs, arguments, laughter and tears. The thought that someone had left me a clue, someone who believed in justice, made my pulse quicken. I returned to our home, the autumn wind whipping against the windows as I made my way to Richard's office. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, familiar and foreign all at once. My fingers trembled as I dialed the combination on the safe. Each number clicked like a heartbeat, echoing in the quiet room. When the lock clicked open, my hands shook as I pulled out the papers inside. A second will. Dated 1 week after the official one. Every word, every line, deliberate. This was Richard's true intention, his real desire. It left everything to me, explicitly stating that Thomas was never to manage his affairs. I held the documents close, a mixture of relief and righteous fury surging through me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the fragile bloom of hope that truth could prevail, that justice could be reclaimed, that the betrayal and darkness surrounding Richard's final months could be illuminated. I sank into the chair beside the desk, the papers trembling in my lap, and allowed myself a moment of quiet catharsis. Tears rolled down my cheeks, unrestrained, cleansing in their intensity. I realized that the journey ahead would be arduous, filled with confrontation, legal battles, and the pain of uncovering every deception. But I also understood, with crystalline clarity, that I was no longer powerless. Somewhere within the maze of grief and betrayal, I had found a spark of resilience, of courage, of determination to fight for what was right. I would honor Richard's memory, not the deceit that had surrounded his last months, and I would reclaim the life and the justice that Thomas had tried to steal. I placed the documents carefully in my bag and looked out the window at the fading light of dusk. The city was alive below me, oblivious to the storm that had touched my life, but in that quiet moment, I felt a sense of purpose, a steady heartbeat in the chaos. I had begun to dig for truth. And for the first time in weeks, I believed I would find it. I carried the second will into Eleanor's office, my hands trembling violently, a mixture of hope and fury coursing through me like electricity. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of months of deception and heartbreak pressing against my chest. Eleanor looked up from her desk, her eyes sharp and calculating, immediately sensing the storm within me. "Lindsay," she said, rising to meet me, "this changes everything, but we need to verify its authenticity and figure out why it never reached probate." Her voice was firm, professional, yet threaded with an empathy that softened the edges of my despair. She had always possessed a rare talent for cutting through chaos, for untangling the web of deceit that others would leave in their wake. We hired a handwriting expert, a quiet man with meticulous eyes who spent hours scrutinizing every curve, every stroke, every imperfection in Richard's signature. When he finally looked up, I saw a flicker of affirmation in his gaze. "Both signatures are genuine," he said, "but the second will show steadier handwriting. This suggests it was signed during a moment of clarity, a time when he understood fully what he was doing." My chest tightened. Relief and rage collided in a chaotic storm. For months, Thomas had manipulated the man I loved, exploited his vulnerability, and used his brother's dementia as a weapon to claim what was never his. And yet here was proof that Richard had fought, even in the quietest of ways, to preserve his true intentions. Despite the legal validation, I could not simply sit and wait for justice to unfold. Thomas was cunning, meticulous, and dangerous. I began to follow him, watching from my car, heart hammering, notebook and phone at the ready. I had never imagined my life would transform into something resembling a detective novel, yet here I was, driven by equal parts fear and determination. Thomas's routines were methodical, almost ritualistic. He frequented a downtown restaurant, always at the same time, always with the same man, Vincent Caruso, a disbarred lawyer with a history of fraud and deception. They spoke in hushed tones, unaware that I was close enough to catch every word, my phone recording the conversation in a trembling hand. "The old fool actually trusted me," Thomas said, his voice casual, almost amused. Once the dementia kicked in, it was easy to get him to sign whatever I wanted. My stomach twisted violently. I felt bile rise, anger and disbelief threatening to consume me entirely. The man I had once called family, the brother of the man I loved, had orchestrated a betrayal so profound it made my hands shake uncontrollably. Vincent laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that cut through the restaurant's hum. "And the wife? Is she still under investigation?" Thomas's voice lowered, almost gleeful. "The police are building a case. That redcoat evidence will seal it." I made sure Margaret saw Lindsay that night. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Thomas had set me up for murder. Every word reverberated in my mind, echoing the horror of months filled with false accusations, suspicion, and the gnawing uncertainty that had haunted every waking moment. But Vincent's next words sent a shiver down my spine that was colder than any I had ever known. "What about the poison? You sure it can't be traced back to us?" I felt my grip on the phone falter, almost dropping it entirely. "Jessica administered it in his vitamins," Thomas said smoothly, thinking it was just sleeping medication I prescribed for his anxiety. "She has no idea she killed him." My breath caught, my vision narrowing. I could hardly believe the magnitude of what I had just heard. Thomas had murdered his own brother, manipulated Jessica into becoming an unwitting accomplice, and set me up to take the fall. I felt the room tilt beneath me, the chaos of grief, betrayal, and disbelief threatening to overwhelm every shred of composure I had left. I left the restaurant. Immediately, my heart pounding so violently I feared it would betray me with each step. I drove straight to Detective Morrison, my hands shaking as I handed her the phone, the recording, the proof of Thomas's treachery. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, her voice tight with caution as she listened, "this is explosive. But we need more concrete evidence. Thomas is careful he'll have an alibi for everything. We need to make sure there's no way he can wriggle out of this." Her words, though measured, could not dampen the fire of determination that had been ignited within me. I knew now that gathering evidence was only part of the battle. The next step was the most dangerous yet essential. Thomas needed to confess publicly, in a way he could neither deny nor escape. That night, I sat in my living room, the shadows of the room stretching long under the dim light, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I thought of Richard, of his steady hands and warm smile, of the life we had built together, imperfect and fragile though it had been. I thought of Jessica and little Noah, innocent victims caught in the whirlwind of Thomas's cruelty. And I thought of my children, Emma and David, whose love and trust had been strained but not broken. I realized then that this was more than a legal battle. It was a fight to reclaim truth, to protect the innocent, and to confront the darkness that had sought to consume us all. And even though fear threatened to paralyze me, even though the enormity of the task ahead seemed insurmountable, I felt a strange, fierce clarity. I would not be silenced. I would not be intimidated. I would see this through, not just for myself but for everyone Thomas had tried to destroy. The web of lies, deceit, and betrayal had begun to unravel, and I was determined to follow each thread to its end. In that moment, I allowed myself to feel the smallest pulse of hope, that justice, however delayed, was within reach, and as I gazed at the darkened streets outside, I whispered to myself, a promise carried only in the quiet of the night, I will not let him win, not now, not ever. The week that followed felt surreal, as though I were stepping into a world both familiar and foreign, a place where grief and determination collided with an intensity I had never known. I reached out to everyone Richard had wronged through Thomas's manipulations, starting with Jessica. She answered the phone with a trembling voice, barely able to speak through her sobs. I could hear Noah in the background, giggling softly, innocent and unaware of the storm surrounding him. "Jessica," I said gently, trying to calm my own racing heart as much as hers, "we need to work together. Thomas destroyed our family, but he won't get away with it." Her voice cracked. "Lindsay, I gave Richard those vitamins every day. Thomas told me they'd help with his stress. Oh God, I killed the man I loved." I felt the surge of grief, the sharp sting of betrayal, and yet I forced myself to take a deep breath. I placed my hand over hers, even through the phone. "No, Jessica, Thomas killed him. You were manipulated, just like all of us. This is not your fault. You loved him, and that love blinded you to the deception. But now, together, we can set things right." The next call was to Emma and David. Their voices carried the weight of suspicion, grief, and guilt, the echoes of accusations they hadn't wanted to voice but had felt compelled to. "Mom," David said quietly, "I can't believe Uncle Thomas would. I mean, we thought Dad was just forgetful. But this is more than we imagined." Emma was more direct, her anger tempered by the grief she tried to suppress. "We've been talking, Mom. We need to act. We can't let him continue to manipulate and steal." Margaret, too, needed reassurance. She had been terrified, knowing what she had seen but frozen by fear and uncertainty. When I finally spoke with her in person, she gripped my hands so tightly I could feel the trembling beneath her composed exterior. "Lindsay, I was so afraid. But I trust you. Tell me what to do." We convened in my living room, the same room where I had hosted book clubs, holiday parties, and countless quiet afternoons with Richard. It felt strange, almost sacred, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of memories, love, and betrayal. I sat everyone down, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "We need to work together. Thomas destroyed our family, but he won't get away with it. Tonight, we begin to take back what's ours, not just for Richard, but for ourselves, for justice, and for every life he manipulated." Jessica clutched little Noah to her chest, tears streaming freely. I was just following Thomas. I thought I was helping. I didn't know." Her voice cracked, and she sobbed openly, the sound raw and human. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her arm. "Jessica, I know. You were manipulated. He used all of us. But we will make this right. And Noah will grow up knowing the truth about his father, not the lies Thomas tried to impose. Eleanor arrived that afternoon, brisk and focused, bringing with her a sharpness that cut through the fog of grief. Here's the plan, she said, spreading papers across my coffee table. It's risky, but it's brilliant. We will host a memorial gala for Richard at the Portland Rose Estate, inviting every business associate, family member, and community leader he ever knew. Thomas won't be able to resist. He'll want to play the grieving brother in front of everyone, and we'll have our moment. I felt a flicker of hope, mingled with a nervous excitement. The idea of confronting him in public, exposing his lies and crimes, was terrifying, but also empowering. The invitations were sent, elegant, dignified, announcing the Richard Hartwell Memorial Foundation launch, a charity in his name to help families dealing with dementia. It felt fitting, honoring Richard's true intentions, turning grief into purpose. Almost immediately, Thomas, our SVPD, he even offered to give a speech. His arrogance and sense of entitlement laying bare his belief that he was untouchable. My stomach turned at the thought. But Eleanor reassured me, that's our leverage. He can't resist the spotlight. And that's when we'll have him. The night before the gala, Detective Morrison agreed to attend undercover with his team, ready to move the moment Thomas crossed the line. I lay awake that night, thought spinning, replaying every betrayal, every act of manipulation, every lie Thomas had told. Fear clawed at me, but beneath it, determination burned hotter than ever. The next morning, I stood before my mirror, slipping into the red dress I had purchased for this very moment. I traced my hands along the fabric, feeling the weight of the past months and the promise of what was to come. I would not face my husband's murderer looking defeated. I would meet him with courage, with clarity, and with justice in my heart. Emma helped me with my hair, tears glistening in her eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry I doubted you. You've always been the strongest person I know. I hugged her tightly, holding on to the warmth of her love, the bond that grief had almost shattered but could not break. Strength isn't about never falling, sweetheart. It's about getting back up and fighting for what's right. Tonight, we reclaim what was stolen, and we honor Richard the way he deserves. As I looked at myself one last time in the mirror, I saw a reflection I hardly recognized. The woman staring back was fragile and fierce, broken and whole, grieving yet determined. She carried the weight of loss, the pain of betrayal, and the hope of justice, all interwoven into a resolve that would not be denied. I whispered to myself. A vow carried into the quiet room. Tonight, we set the truth free. Tonight, he cannot escape what he has done. The Portland Rose Estate glimmered like a jewel beneath the crisp November sky, every light catching the late autumn chill and casting a soft glow over the sprawling gardens. The estate had always been magnificent, but tonight it felt transformed. Charged with purpose and tension, 200 guests filled the grand hall, murmuring quietly. Their faces a mixture of sorrow, curiosity, and anticipation. Every detail, the crystal chandeliers, the velvet drapes, the delicate arrangements of roses seemed to hum with the weight of memory and the gravity of what was to come. I arrived in my red dress feeling a strange mixture of vulnerability and power. It was the same dress I had tried on countless times in the privacy of my bedroom, imagining this night, rehearsing the words I would speak, envisioning the moment when truth would finally pierce the carefully constructed lies of Thomas Hartwell. My reflection in the mirrored foyer caught me off guard. I saw a woman refined yet raw, mourning yet resolute, grief and determination intertwined in every line of my face. For months, I had felt shattered, stripped bare by betrayal and loss. And yet now, I felt a deep, burning clarity. I would not allow fear or sorrow to define me. Tonight, justice would finally be served. Thomas moved through the crowd with ease, his practiced smile and handshake a mask as polished as any politician's. He kissed the cheeks of mourners, accepted condolences with a precision honed over years of manipulation, and spoke in the soft, soothing tones of a brother who had suffered alongside everyone else. "Lindsay, this is a beautiful tribute to my brother," he said, pressing his lips to my cheek with sickening familiarity. "He would have loved this." I forced a polite smile, though my heart roared with suppressed fury. "Yes, Richard always valued truth and integrity," I replied, my voice steady, carrying across the murmur of the room. "That's why tonight is so important inside." I could feel the fire of years of betrayal, injustice, and grief pushing me forward, propelling me toward a moment I had envisioned countless times but never truly dared to believe would come. The evening passed in a blur of small interactions, consoling guests, shaking hands, exchanging polite words, but every glance toward Thomas reminded me of the stakes. His confidence seemed unwavering, but I knew the careful mask could crack, and when it did, every deception would shatter in the light of truth. As the clock neared 8, I took a deep breath, feeling the air vibrate with tension and anticipation. I stepped onto the stage, the polished wood cold beneath my shoes, the spotlight warming my face in a way that felt both exposing and empowering. The room hushed instantly. Hundreds of eyes turning toward me, waiting. My hands were steady now, my voice firm. Yet beneath the surface, my heart thundered with the weight of memory, loss, and determination. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my gaze sweeping over faces familiar and unknown, friends and colleagues of Richard, our family, and even Thomas's carefully selected audience. My husband Richard was a complicated man, but he loved his family and believed in justice. Tonight, we're here not just to remember him, but to reveal the truth about his death. Murmurs ran through the crowd, a ripple of tension that made my chest tighten. Thomas's smile faltered, a flicker of unease passing over his carefully composed expression. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod toward Eleanor, who had prepared the visual presentation and ensured every document and record was ready to speak where I could not. 3 months ago, Richard was diagnosed with early-onset dementia. I continued, my voice unwavering despite the tremor of raw emotion beneath it. He was vulnerable, confused, and afraid. Someone took advantage of that vulnerability, someone he trusted completely. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I saw the subtle shifts in the room, eyes narrowing, hands tightening on glasses, whispers rising and fading like restless wind. The weight of Richard's absence pressed against me, yet I felt his presence too, in every corner of the estate, in the hearts of those who truly knew him. Richard's brother Thomas accompanied him to every doctor's appointment, had access to his finances, and convinced him to change his will while his mind was deteriorating. My voice gained strength with each word, fueled by months of discovery, grief, and the unshakable conviction that justice must be done. Thomas's chair scraped against the polished floor. "This is absurd. Lindsay, grief has made you paranoid." I cut him off, my voice rising with a resonance I did not know I possessed until that moment. "Sit down, Thomas," I commanded. Every eye in the room turned toward him. My heart pounded not with fear but with a fierce clarity. "Because I have proof of everything, including a recording of you admitting to murder." A hush fell over the room, thick and suffocating. The spotlight seemed brighter, sharper, illuminating not just me but the raw tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. I felt my pulse in my throat, in my hands. In the quiet spaces between every gasp that rippled through the audience, Thomas's face contorted. With a mix of outrage, disbelief and desperation, his carefully constructed full weight of grief and authority began to crack, revealing the venom beneath the mask, the arrogance and cruelty that had caused so much suffering. For the first time, the room saw him not as the polished, grieving brother, but as the man who had betrayed, manipulated, and destroyed the lives around him. And as I stood there, bathed in light and clarity, I felt the weight of months lift slightly from my shoulders. I realized that this night was not just about exposing Thomas, but about reclaiming the power that had been stripped from all of us: justice for Richard, protection for Jessica and Noah, and the restoration of truth to a life marred by lies. In that moment, I understood something profound. Grief had taught me resilience, betrayal had taught me vigilance, and love for Richard, for my children, for those caught in the web of deceit had taught me courage. And courage, I realized, was the most luminous armor of all. The room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press against my skin, the kind of silence that carries a weight so heavy you can feel it in your bones. My fingers lingered on the microphone for a moment, trembling not with fear, but with the raw, electric surge of months of grief, discovery, and relentless determination. Then Eleanor nodded at me from the side of the stage, a subtle gesture that ignited a fire of courage inside me. I pressed play. The soft hum of static gave way to Thomas's voice, every syllable sharper than a blade, slicing through the tension in the grand ballroom. The old fool actually trusted me. The poison can't be traced back to us. His voice carried arrogance, cruelty, and the chilling indifference of a man who believed himself untouchable. Gasps erupted, a cascade of disbelief and horror sweeping across the room. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Every eye turned toward Thomas, whose face transitioned from red to a ghastly white, his polished facade crumbling before the witnesses he had tried so long to manipulate. He opened his mouth, a frantic attempt to reclaim control, but the words faltered, empty and weak. That recording is fake. Lindsay fabricated it because she's desperate. She's the one under investigation. He shouted, the venom in his voice filling the room like a foul storm cloud. Detective Morrison emerged from the crowd, moving with a calm authority that silenced even Thomas. His badge gleamed under the chandeliers. Actually, Mr. Hartwell, we've verified its authenticity. We've also arrested Vincent Caruso, who's been very cooperative. Every detail has been cross-checked and confirmed. The crowd's murmurs swelled into a wave of stunned whispers. Faces turned toward me, some shocked, some incredulous, some quietly relieved. My chest felt tight, yet buoyed with an undeniable sense of justice. I glanced at Jessica, who stood clutching little Noah to her chest, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, a mix of grief and a fragile hope. She whispered through her sobs, voice breaking, "You told me those were vitamins for stress. You made me kill him." I knelt slightly to meet her gaze, placing my hand gently on her shoulder. "Jessica, it wasn't you. You were misled, manipulated just like all of us." Thomas used fear, trust, and love to bend reality to his cruel will. "You didn't kill Richard, Thomas did." The eyes of the guests, their faces frozen in disbelief, now shifted back to Thomas as uniformed police officers moved silently but decisively to surround him. His lips twisted into a snarl, a mask of rage replacing the terror he had felt moments before. But I wasn't finished. I straightened, allowing the clarity of months of investigation, heartbreak, and relentless pursuit of truth to pour into my words. "There's more," I said, my voice ringing in the hall, steady and unwavering. "Thomas didn't just murder his brother. He systematically stole from him, manipulated a young woman into being an unwitting accomplice, and even attempted to frame me for the crime by having someone wear my red coat at the motel that morning." Eleanor pressed a button, and financial records appeared on the screen behind me. Each line, each figure, told a story of betrayal, greed, and callous disregard for family. Over $500,000 had been embezzled from Richard's accounts over the course of 2 years. I let the numbers hang in the air, letting their stark clarity land with the weight they deserved. The second will, the real will, was hidden because Thomas bribed the probate clerk to lose it. I continued, my eyes sweeping the room, connecting with those who had loved Richard and felt powerless, but Richard, in a moment of clarity, had also filed a copy with his attorney in Seattle. The truth cannot be buried by greed or malice. Thomas's composure shattered completely. He lunged toward the exit, his expression twisted in rage, but officers intercepted him, gripping his arms firmly and halting his desperate escape. His voice rose, sharp and filled with unrestrained fury. "You self-righteous bitch. Richard was weak. He didn't deserve that money. I built his business while he played house with you." I held my ground, my voice calm and unwavering, resonating with the hard-earned authority that grief and resilience had carved into me. "There it is," I said, letting every guest hear the bitter truth of the man he had revealed himself to be. The real Thomas. A man who murdered his own brother out of jealousy and greed. A man who cared nothing for justice, for family, for truth. Even as officers handcuffed him, Thomas continued to rage, his words raw, bitter, and desperate. "I should have killed you too. You were always in the way, always the perfect wife, the beloved Lindsay. Well, I hope you rot." Detective Morrison stepped in, his voice calm, cutting through the chaos. "Mr. Hartwell, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Thomas's screams faded into the background as the officers guided him out. The ballroom was still, the weight of the moment settling over every guest like a tangible presence. I felt a deep exhale escape me, the kind of breath that carries months of sorrow, anxiety, and determination finally released. My legs trembled, but it was not fear, it was the physical echo of the relief, the catharsis of witnessing justice done. I turned toward Jessica, Emma, David, and Margaret, their faces streaked with tears, their expressions a mixture of awe, relief, and tentative hope. I reached for their hands, squeezing them gently. "We did it," I whispered, not just to them, but to the memory of Richard, to the truth we had unearthed, to the fragile but undeniable sense of justice now alive in the room. And in that moment, I realized that this night, this confrontation, this unveiling of the dark and twisted thread Thomas had spun through our lives was not just about punishment. It was about reclaiming our dignity, our family, our sense of right and wrong. It was about standing firmly in the light, letting the shadows of deceit and betrayal dissolve in the clarity of truth. As the murmurs of astonishment and relief grew into quiet conversations, I felt a warmth spread through me, a fragile, radiant hope that even in the aftermath of heartbreak and betrayal, the human heart has the capacity to heal, to rise, and to create a future shaped not by the cruelty of others, but by the courage and integrity we choose to carry forward. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night at the Portland Rose Estate. I stood once again in the solemn grandeur of the Portland courthouse, the same building where Thomas had finally received his sentence, life in prison for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The walls seemed quieter now, less oppressive, and yet they carried the weight of everything that had happened: the betrayals, the grief, the sleepless nights of doubt and fear, and the relentless search for truth. The validation of the real will had been more than a legal victory. It was the restoration of justice, the unearthing of the truth that Thomas had tried so desperately to bury. I inherited everything Richard had worked for, the fruits of decades of labor, care, and devotion. But more than the tangible assets, the inheritance brought something far more profound: my name cleared, my honor intact, and the knowledge that the story of my life with Richard, complex and imperfect as it had been, was now protected from lies and deceit. The days that followed were filled with quiet rebuilding. I chose to use a portion of the inheritance to establish the Richard Hartwell Foundation, a project I poured my heart into. It was more than charity, it was a promise, a commitment to families navigating the labyrinth of dementia care, to seniors vulnerable to exploitation, to those whose voices were too easily silenced. Each phone call, each letter, each face I encountered through the foundation reminded me why I had fought so fiercely. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about care, advocacy, and hope. Jessica and little Noah moved into the guest house on our property. Watching them settle in, I saw the fragile beginnings of healing. Noah, with his bright blue eyes so like Richard's, began to laugh freely, unburdened by the shadows that had plagued his early months. Jessica, who had been an unwilling participant in Thomas's schemes, learned slowly to trust again. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching Noah chase the sunlight across the garden, she turned to me, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Hartwell Lindsay, I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears glinting in the afternoon sun. "You could have hated me, blamed me, but instead you gave us a home, a safe place." I took her hand gently. "You were a victim too, Jessica. And Noah, he's Richard's son. Family means we take care of each other, even when it's complicated. That's what we do, and that's what we will continue to do." My own children, Emma and David, began visiting every month. The cold distance that had stretched between us in the wake of Richard's death slowly melted away. Our conversations were no longer punctuated by accusation or suspicion, but by laughter, reminiscence, and the cautious but growing trust that had once been fractured. The healing was uneven, some days heavy with memory, others light with tentative joy, but it was steady, tangible, and real. Margaret, ever my anchor, became my closest friend. Our morning walks became sacred rituals. We laughed about our survival, shared quiet confessions, and reflected on the fragility of life and the unexpected reservoirs of strength we had discovered in ourselves. The ordinary moments, once mundane, became extraordinary in their simplicity: the scent of the earth after rain, the warmth of sunlight on our faces, the comfort of shared silence. On what would have been my 41st wedding anniversary, I carried Richard's ashes to his favorite spot by the Columbia River. The river flowed with quiet determination, much like the life I had lived beside him, and I allowed myself a long, reflective pause. "You weren't perfect, Richard," I whispered, voice carried by the wind over the water, "but you didn't deserve what Thomas did to you. I hope you found peace." I scattered the ashes, each fleck drifting into the current, a final act of love, acceptance, and release. As I walked back to my car, the phone rang, Eleanor calling with urgent, almost excited news. 3 other families had come forward, victims of Thomas's manipulations before Richard's death. Eleanor's words were filled with awe and pride. Your courage to speak up publicly at the gala saved other people, Lindsay. You're a hero. You gave them the courage to come forward, to seek justice, and to reclaim their lives. I smiled, the kind of deep, soul-stirring smile that comes from recognizing how far you've come. I thought back to the terrified woman I had been 6 months ago, ready to run from the chaos, from the pain, from the truth. That woman had been broken, yes, but she had discovered something even more precious. Strength isn't about never being broken. It's about refusing to stay broken, about standing in the face of injustice and letting the light of truth guide you forward. I drove home to my new family, Jessica, Noah, and the community of survivors we had gathered. Their laughter echoed through the halls, a symphony of resilience and hope. Justice, I realized, was not just about seeing a criminal punished, it was about restoring dignity, building a life of integrity, and nurturing love in the spaces where fear and deceit had once prevailed. At 63, I had learned the most profound lesson of all: life's greatest injustices, its deepest betrayals, and its darkest chapters can become the catalysts for the most powerful transformations. They teach us who we truly are, who we can become, and what it means to face fear with courage, grief with grace, and betrayal with unwavering truth. Speaking the truth, no matter how terrifying, is the only way to truly be free, and in freedom, there is hope, healing, and the promise of a new beginning. And as I settled into the calm of my home, watching the late afternoon light spill over the garden where Noah laughed and Jessica smiled, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey, the lessons, and the strength that had carried me through. Life would never be simple or perfect again, but it would be real, and it would be ours. If this story touched your heart, guided you closer to understanding strength in the face of adversity, or inspired you to face your own truths, please subscribe to our channel. Together, we explore the resilience of the human spirit, the courage to stand in the light, and the hope that even in our darkest moments, a brighter tomorrow is always possible.